Most of what you think you know about the Crusades is wrong, and I don't mean slightly off. I mean fundamentally, structurally, embarrassingly wrong. The version of history that most of us grew up with, the version baked into school textbooks, echoed in prestige documentaries, and tossed around by politicians whenever they want to score cheap rhetorical points, goes something like this. A bunch of greedy, bloodthirsty European knights, whipped into a frenzy by a power-hungry pope, launched an unprovoked war of aggression against a peaceful, sophisticated, and entirely mind-its-own-business Muslim world. They slaughtered their way across the Middle East, stole land, exploited people, and set the stage for centuries of geopolitical trauma that echo all the way to our modern news cycles. It is a neat story. It has villains, victims, clear battle lines, and a neat moral takeaway. It is also, in almost every important respect, a complete distortion. Now, before we go another step, let me be entirely clear. The Crusades were brutal. They involved massacres, political betrayals, and unforgivable atrocities committed against innocent people, including fellow Christians and Jewish communities who had nothing whatsoever to do with the conflict. None of what we are going to explore here is an attempt to whitewash that violence or pretend it never happened. History doesn't need to be sanitized to be understood. But what we are going to do today is look at the actual sequence of events, the actual motivations, and the genuine geopolitical pressures that created the crusading movement in the first place. Because when you strip away the modern mythology and look at the raw, unvarnished history, what you find is far more complicated, far more interesting, and infinitely more relevant to the world we live in today than the simplified comic book version most of us were taught. So, where does the story actually begin? If you ask most people, they will point straight to the year 1095, when Pope Urban II stepped up to a podium at the Council of Clermont and called for the First Crusade. But 1095 is not the beginning. It is the middle. To truly understand why the Crusades happened, you have to rewind the clock, roughly 4.5 centuries before a single European knight ever set foot in the Holy Land. To modern ears, it sounds strange to think of the Middle East, North Africa, and the Mediterranean Rim as the heartlands of Christendom. We tend to map history through modern cultural lenses, but in the early 7th century, that entire geographic sweep was overwhelmingly Christian. Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Asia Minor, what we now call modern Turkey, and the breadth of North Africa were Christian civilizations with centuries of deep-rooted history. These were not peripheral outposts on the edge of the map. They were the absolute core. The great theological debates that shaped Christian thought, the earliest monastic communities, the church councils, and the cities that produced the most influential figures in Christian history, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, all emerged from and anchored this region. And then, in the 630s, everything shifted on a tectonic scale. Following the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632, Arab armies surged outward from the Arabian Peninsula with a speed, discipline, and ferocity that stunned the known world. Within a single decade, they conquered the entirety of the Persian Empire and ripped enormous, vital chunks of territory away from the Byzantine Empire, which was the direct continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire and, at that moment, the most powerful Christian state on earth. Damascus fell in 635. Jerusalem, the holiest city in the Christian universe, fell in 638. Alexandria, the intellectual and economic jewel of the ancient Mediterranean, fell in 642. By the close of the 7th century, Muslim armies had swept across the entirety of North Africa, territories that had been Roman and then Christian for over half a millennium. We need to pause right here and let that sink in, because modern historical retellings love to gloss over the nature of these early conquests. The lands that these armies swept across were not empty wildernesses. They were deeply established, highly sophisticated Christian civilizations with centuries of infrastructure, law, theology, and culture. The millions of people living there did not invite conquest. They were overrun by a military force that was, at that precise moment in history, virtually unstoppable. And the expansion did not halt at the edges of North Africa. In 711, Muslim forces crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and poured into the Iberian Peninsula, wiping out the Visigothic Christian kingdom that had ruled Spain and Portugal for centuries. From there, the push continued across the Pyrenees into the heart of Western Europe. It was not until 732, just 1 century after the death of Muhammad, at the Battle of Tours, led by the Frankish commander Charles Martel, that this westward advance was finally halted. Historians have argued for generations about the gravity of that single battle. Had the Franks lost at Tours, the entire religious, political, and cultural trajectory of Western civilization would have been rewritten. Islam would have dominated Western Europe alongside the East. Think about that timeline. By the early 8th century, roughly 100 years after the initial expansion began, approximately 2/3 of the formerly Christian world had been conquered. 2/3. The entire southern and eastern rim of the Mediterranean was now under Islamic rule. The Byzantine Empire, once a sprawling superpower stretching from Spain to Mesopotamia, was brutally reduced to a fractured rump state clinging desperately to Asia Minor and parts of Greece. And the military pressure never let up. For centuries, the Christian world was entirely on the defensive, losing strategic ground decade after decade, generation after generation. Muslim fleets battered the walls of Constantinople repeatedly. Raiders sacked southern Italy, seized Sicily, and captured Crete. Yet, when you look at the popular cultural narrative today, none of this history exists. The story of the Crusades always starts in 1095, as though a massive, multi-nation military expedition simply erupted out of nowhere. A random, unprovoked act of European violence against a world that was quietly minding its own business. That framing only works if you deliberately erase 4.5 centuries of prior military conquest. And erasing 4.5 centuries of vital context isn't doing history, it is doing propaganda. To understand why Europe finally reacted, why thousands of men mortgaged their lands, abandoned their homes, and marched thousands of miles toward certain death, you have to look at what happens when a civilization feels the walls closing in for 400 years. The Crusades were not born in a vacuum of sudden malice. They were born out of a profound, agonizing sense of existential encirclement. For 4.5 centuries, Western Christendom absorbed blow after blow, retreating further into its own borders while the geopolitical map of the world was violently rewritten around it. But a civilization can only retreat so far before it hits a wall. For the medieval European world, that wall was reached in the 11th century, and the impact of hitting it shattered the status quo forever. To understand what finally triggered the Crusades, we have to look past the grand rhetoric of popes and kings and examine a catastrophic military defeat that most people today have never even heard of. A single battle in a remote corner of Anatolia that quietly changed the course of human history. The date was August 26th, 1071. The place was Manzikert, located in eastern Anatolia, near what is now modern Turkey. On that freezing plateau, the Byzantine Emperor Romanos, the fourth Diogenes, led a massive, sprawling imperial army against the advancing forces of the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks were a relatively new and formidable power on the world stage. Originally Turkic nomads from the vast steppes of Central Asia, they had converted to Islam and were now in the middle of a relentless westward expansion, carving out a massive empire that stretched from Persia deep into the heart of the Middle East. Their sultan, Alp Arslan, was a military genius, a brilliant commander whose forces were disciplined, blindingly fast, and devastatingly effective. The Byzantine army, by contrast, was a complete mess. It was a fractured patchwork force of native Byzantine troops, foreign Frankish mercenaries, Norman adventurers, and various other ethnic contingents that harbored little to no loyalty toward one another or toward the emperor. Decades of internal political backstabbing, economic decline, and palace intrigue had hollowed out the empire's military readiness, and at Manzikert, those internal fractures turned fatal. At the most critical, white-knuckle moment of the battle, a Byzantine general named Andronikos Doukas, who harbored his own treasonous political ambitions back in Constantinople, deliberately turned his troops around and withdrew from the field. To make matters worse, some of the Turkish mercenaries fighting within the Byzantine ranks looked across the battlefield, recognized their ethnic kin, and switched sides on the spot. The Byzantine formation collapsed inward like a house of cards. Emperor Romanos himself was dragged from his horse and captured on the battlefield, an unimaginable humiliation that had not happened to a Roman or Byzantine emperor in centuries. Now, purely in terms of immediate military casualties, Manzikert was not a total annihilation. The army wasn't wiped off the face of the earth, but the political and psychological fallout was utterly catastrophic. When Romanos was eventually ransomed and released by Alp Arslan, he limped back to Constantinople only to find that his political rivals had already seized the throne. They arrested him, blinded him with a red-hot iron rod, threw him into a dungeon, and left him to die of his injuries. With the central authority broken, the Byzantine Empire plunged headfirst into a brutal period of civil war and total political anarchy. And while the Greeks were busy tearing each other apart in palace coups, the Seljuk Turks simply walked right into Anatolia. There was no army left to stop them. Within a single decade, the Seljuks conquered nearly all of Asia Minor, the demographic and agricultural heartland of the Byzantine Empire. They established the Sultanate of Rum, setting up their capital at Nicaea, sitting just across the narrow strip of water from Constantinople itself. They captured Edessa in 1078. They took Antioch, one of the most sacred and historically vital cities in the Christian world. And in 1087, they seized Jerusalem from its previous Muslim rulers, the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt. The seizure of Jerusalem was the final domino. Under the Fatimid Caliphate, Christian pilgrims had generally been allowed to visit the Holy Land with relative, though sometimes fragile, safety. The Fatimids were a Shia dynasty who profited heavily from the lucrative pilgrim trade, so they had a clear economic incentive to keep the roads open. The Seljuk Turks operated entirely differently. They were Orthodox Sunni Muslims, deeply aggressive and right in the middle of an uncompromising expansionary jihad. Almost overnight, horrifying reports began filtering back across Europe. Christian pilgrims were being systematically robbed, beaten, enslaved, and murdered on the roads to Jerusalem. Were some of these horror stories exaggerated by medieval chroniclers who loved a dramatic flair? Absolutely. Medieval accounts were never known for their chill or restraint, but the underlying reality was undeniable. The ancient pilgrimage routes to the holiest sites in Christendom had been slammed shut, and the Byzantine Empire, which had spent centuries acting as a massive armored shield protecting Western Europe from the east, was now bleeding out and on the verge of total collapse. It was against this terrifying backdrop that the Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I Comnenus, made a desperate, fateful move. In March of 1095, he dispatched a high-level embassy straight to Pope Urban II in Rome with an urgent, pleading request for military assistance. Alexios was a shrewd, pragmatic survivor. He had managed to patch together some stability in Constantinople, but he knew cold math. He did not have the manpower to push the Seljuks out of Anatolia by himself. He wasn't asking for a holy crusade. He was asking for Western mercenaries, hardened professional soldiers he could hire to help him reclaim his lost territory. He expected a few thousand armed knights. What he accidentally triggered was an avalanche. Pope Urban II was a remarkable, highly complex political operator. Born into the French nobility, educated at elite cathedral schools, and forged in the influential monastery of Cluny, Urban took the papacy at a time when it was deeply fractured. He was locked in a bitter, venomous power struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor over who held supreme authority to appoint church officials, a crisis known as the investiture controversy. Western Christendom was split down the middle, and papal authority was slipping away. When Alexios's plea landed on Urban's desk, the Pope didn't just see a military favor for a desperate Greek emperor. He saw a once-in-a-lifetime geopolitical opportunity. Urban realized he could solve multiple existential problems at once. If he could unite the violently fractious, warring noble houses of Europe under a single transcendent banner, he could stop them from butchering each other back home. If he could position the papacy as the commander-in-chief of a massive pan-European military expedition, he could decisively reassert the Pope's supreme moral and political authority over every secular king and emperor in the West. And above all, he could answer the frantic cries of his fellow Christians in the East before the entire Levantine world was permanently erased. On November 27, 1095, at the Council of Clermont in central France, Pope Urban II stepped up to deliver what historians widely regard as the most explosive, effective speech in European history. No official transcript of that speech was ever written down, but we have at least 5 different accounts recorded by eyewitnesses in the crowd, and while their wording differs, every single one of them agrees on the emotional core. Urban painted a vivid, visceral picture of the suffering of Eastern Christians. He spoke of desecrated altars, tortured priests, and defiled holy shrines. He pointed directly at the knights and warlords of Europe, men whose entire lives were defined by local blood feuds, cattle raiding, and brutal internal warfare, and offered them a radically new destiny. He called upon them to take up the cross, drop their petty local squabbles, and march east to defend their brothers and liberate Jerusalem. And then he dropped the line that completely electrified the audience. Urban announced that anyone who undertook this grueling journey purely out of devotion, as an act of penance to liberate the church, would receive a full and immediate remission of all their sins. To modern, secular minds, it is easy to miss the sheer atomic weight of that promise. In 11th century Europe, people did not view religion as a weekend hobby or a philosophical preference. It was the absolute operating system of reality. Heaven and hell were not metaphors. Eternal damnation was a terrifying, hyper-realistic certainty. Every single knight in that field knew he was a sinner. To practice medieval warfare meant committing horrific violence, butchering men and burning villages, leaving behind a crushing, soul-crushing burden of guilt. The The church had a penitential system for handling that guilt, but the traditional penances were severe, lonely, and grueling. What Urban was offering was revolutionary. He was telling these violent warriors that the very thing they did best, fighting, could instantly become an instrument of spiritual salvation. Instead of spending months doing lonely penance, they could strap on their armor, march to Jerusalem, and wipe their slate clean in combat. The crowd didn't just applaud, they erupted. A massive roar swept across the open field. Deus vult! God wills it. On the spot, thousands of noblemen sliced strips of cloth into crosses and pinned them to their tunics. Within weeks, the message spread like wildfire across France, Germany, England, and Italy. Europe was mobilized. A continent of fragmented, squabbling feudal states was suddenly hurtling toward a massive, coordinated collision with the East. But as those armies began to assemble, nobody, least of all Pope Urban, had any real idea of what kind of chaotic, unstoppable monster they had just unleashed. The grand vision that Pope Urban II laid out at Clermont was neat, orderly, and deeply calculated. But history rarely follows a script, and when the crusading movement actually began to move, it instantly descended into a staggering study in human chaos, profound heroism, and sickening horror. The very first wave to set out toward the east was not the disciplined, heavily armored host of professional knights that the Pope had envisioned. Instead, it was a ragged, uncontrolled, and desperate mass of peasants, minor clergymen, and rootless vagrants led by a charismatic ascetic preacher known to history as Peter the Hermit. This chaotic phenomenon, which modern historians call the People's Crusade, departed in the spring of 1096, months before the actual noble armies were even ready to march. Peter's followers were utterly unequipped for what lay ahead. They had almost no food, no supply lines, zero understanding of geography, and no military discipline whatsoever. And before they had even crossed out of Western Europe, they committed one of the most shameful, dark atrocities of the entire medieval era. As the frenzied religious fever of the Crusade swept through the towns of France and Germany, certain violent factions within this peasant horde turned their hatred away from the distant Muslims and inward toward local targets. In the bustling trading cities of the Rhineland, places like Speyer, Worms, Mainz, and Cologne, bands of crusaders led by ruthless fanatics like Count Amico of Flaunheim fell upon local Jewish communities, carrying out brutal, indiscriminate massacres. The twisted logic behind these pogroms was chillingly simple. Why march thousands of miles across the earth to fight the enemies of Christ when, in their eyes, the enemies of Christ were living right down the street? Local bishops and civic authorities tried desperately to intervene. The Bishop of Speyer managed to shield some of the town's Jewish residents, but in Mainz, the mob completely overwhelmed the defenses of the local archbishop's palace. Historians estimate that anywhere from 2,000 to 12,000 Jewish men, women, and children were slaughtered in a matter of weeks. It was the worst outbreak of anti-Jewish violence Europe had seen up to that point, setting a horrific, tragic precedent that would cast a long shadow over subsequent crusades. It is vital to note that Pope Urban never called for violence against Jewish communities. The official stance of the Church condemned the attacks outright. But this uncovers a terrifying, undeniable truth about mass movements. When you deliberately weaponize religious fervor on a continental scale, you lose the ability to control where that weapon lands. The energy cannot be neatly channeled. It spills over, corrupts, and destroys. Unsurprisingly, the People's Crusade came to a swift, catastrophic end. After stumbling through the Balkans, looting local towns, and clashing constantly with angry Byzantine border guards, the ragged survivors finally reached Constantinople. Emperor Alexios looked out across the chaotic, undisciplined mob camped outside his capital, realized they were a liability rather than an asset, and quickly ferried them across the Bosphorus Strait into Asia Minor just to get them out of his sight. Within days, an organized Seljuk Turkish army ambushed and completely annihilated them. Peter the Hermit survived only because he happened to be back in Constantinople negotiating supply lines, but the vast majority of his followers were wiped out or sold into slavery. The People's Crusade was over before it had even truly begun. The real military crusade, the one led by the Grand Barons and Princes of Europe, was an entirely different beast. It was heavily financed, professionally organized, and commanded by hardened veterans of feudal warfare. Figures like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and Bohemond of Taranto converged on Constantinople between late 1096 and early 1097. Emperor Alexios felt a wave of profound relief seeing real soldiers, but that relief was laced with deep suspicion. He forced each Crusader leader to swear an oath of loyalty, promising to hand back any conquered Byzantine territory to the crown. Some swore willingly. Others, like the cunning Norman adventurer Bohemond, crossed their fingers behind their backs with obvious insincerity. Once across into Anatolia, the professional army proved its worth. They besieged and captured Nicaea, breaking the back of the Seljuk advance, and then pushed deep into the burning, waterless Anatolian plateau during the height of summer. Horses died by the thousands. Men collapsed from heat, thirst, and exhaustion. Yet they pressed forward, arriving outside the ancient, massive walls of Antioch in October of 1097. What followed was an 8-month nightmare of biblical proportions. The siege of Antioch was an ordeal of grueling starvation, freezing winter weather, disease, and relentless counterattacks. At their lowest point, starving crusaders were reportedly boiling leather shoes and eating whatever scraps they could find. Yet, through a mix of unyielding grit and 11th-hour bribery, when a disgruntled guard inside the city was paid off to open a gate, the Crusaders breached Antioch in June of 1098. No sooner had they taken the city than a massive Muslim relief army arrived, trapping the exhausted Crusaders inside the very city they had just conquered. In a desperate, do-or-die breakout battle outside the walls, the Crusaders somehow won, a victory they attributed directly to the hand of God. From there, the survivors trudged south toward their ultimate psychological destination, Jerusalem. By the time they arrived at the Holy City in June of 1099, the political landscape had shifted again. The rival Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt had recaptured Jerusalem from the Seljuks. The Crusaders, now whittled down from tens of thousands to a stubborn core of roughly 12 to 13,000 starving, battle-hardened soldiers, threw themselves into a final, desperate siege. On July 15th, 1099, they smashed through the stone fortifications. What happened next remains an ugly, indelible stain on history. The Crusaders launched into a horrific, bloody massacre of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Mosques were desecrated, and thousands were slaughtered in the streets. While later, Victorian chroniclers and modern polemicists often exaggerated these accounts, claiming the blood ran knee-deep in the streets, a physical impossibility, the raw reality was a brutal, inexcusable war crime by any ancient or modern standard. Yet, even here, history demands honesty rather than simplistic moralizing. Medieval warfare across all cultures and civilizations was unimaginably savage. The custom of putting a city to the sword after it refused a negotiated surrender was standard military practice of the era, practiced equally by Christian and Muslim armies alike. It does not excuse the bloodshed, but it strips away the lazy modern myth that this violence was a uniquely European anomaly. The fall of Jerusalem led directly to the creation of the Crusader states, independent feudal territories like the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, and the Principality of Antioch that clung to the Mediterranean coast for nearly 2 centuries. And this brings us to one of the most persistent, widespread falsehoods in popular history, the idea that these states were early prototypes of European colonialism. Modern historical scholarship, pioneered by giants like Jonathan Riley Smith, has comprehensively dismantled the colonial framework. The Crusader states had no mother country funding them, no industrial empire backing them, and no policy of economic exploitation. In fact, going on a crusade was financial suicide. Knights routinely mortgaged their ancestral manors, sold their lands, and bled themselves dry just to fund the journey. The vast majority of Crusaders never wanted to live in the East permanently. They fulfilled their vows, survived what they could, and hurried back home to Europe as fast as possible. The European Catholic population in these states was always a tiny minority, less than 10%, meaning these fragile kingdoms survived only through complex everyday cooperation, trade, and coexistence with the local Muslim, Jewish, and Eastern Christian populations. Perhaps the most fascinating irony of all is how the Muslim world viewed these events. For centuries after they occurred, medieval Islamic societies did not view the Crusades as a central, defining trauma. To them, the Crusaders were just a minor, eccentric annoyance on the fringe of the Mediterranean. The real existential catastrophes of the era were the brutal Mongol invasions of the 13th century, which utterly devastated the heart of the Islamic world on a scale the Crusaders could never have imagined. The narrative of the Crusades as a permanent, existential clash of civilizations is largely a modern invention, cooked up in the 19th century during the height of actual European imperialism to serve contemporary political agendas. And that is the ultimate takeaway of this entire sprawling, messy history. History is never just a simple story of pure heroes and absolute villains. It is a mirror reflecting whatever the current generation wants to see. When we strip away the propaganda, the modern political spin, and the comforting myths, we find something far more human, a story of people backed into corners by centuries of existential pressure, making desperate, deeply flawed choices driven by a potent mix of blinding faith, raw fear, ruthless ambition, and unyielding survival instinct. When you erase historical context, you don't just misunderstand the past, you weaponize it against the present. And once you see the Crusades not as a cartoonish fable, but as the complicated, tragic, deeply human saga it actually was, the real world suddenly starts to make a whole lot more sense.